John Mitchell, a decorated Vietnam veteran, stared in disbelief as his hard-earned pension vanished, frozen by an unfeeling machine that branded him a criminal. With bills piling up and no answers, his world began to crumble. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. John Mitchell stared at the glaring message on his computer screen, his hands trembling slightly, not from age, but from a swelling tide of helpless anger. The words, "Account frozen for verification," burned into his mind like a slap in the face. How could this be happening to him? A man who'd worn the uniform of the United States Army, who had given his youth and his health to a country that now refused to honor its most basic promise: financial security. The cold blue glow of the screen reflected the weight of years of frustration and a deep sense of betrayal. His mornings had once started with quiet routines: coffee, the newspaper, then checking his pension deposit, a predictable fixture that kept his small world steady. But today was different. The familiar numbers were gone, replaced by a bureaucratic riddle that seemed impossible to solve. The bank's vague explanation, "Suspicious activity detected," felt like a personal insult. John wasn't a criminal. He was a retired soldier with a history that screamed trustworthiness. Yet the faceless system didn't care. It had deemed him a risk based on patterns too complex for him to understand and too impersonal for him to challenge. John's fingers dialed the customer service number again, hope mingling with frustration. Each time, a robotic voice guided him through endless menus, punctuated by long holds and transfers that led nowhere. When a human finally answered, their tone was rehearsed, distant, and impatient. Requests piled up: his military ID, proof of residence, even scans of documents he hadn't thought he'd need to produce again at his age. The most painful demand was the request for his birth certificate, a relic from his distant past, dredged up as if to question his very existence. Every request chipped away at his pride, turning his dignity to dust. As the hours slipped by, John's mind spun with the implications. No payment meant no rent, no groceries, no medication refills. His wife, Carol, noticed the tightening lines around his eyes and the stiff set of his jaw when he spoke. The fear of letting her down gnawed at him, worse than the financial strain. This wasn't just a frozen account. It was a personal attack on everything he'd worked for, an erasure of the sacrifices he'd made. The system meant to protect him was instead suffocating him in red tape and cold algorithms. Behind the scenes, John's case was just one among thousands flagged by the bank's new AI-driven fraud detection system. Designed to identify anomalies in spending and transaction patterns, it lacked nuance or empathy. It didn't recognize that a veteran's pension might occasionally be spent on medical supplies, groceries in bulk, or payments to local charities, patterns outside the algorithm's narrow definition of normal. Instead, the system painted John as suspicious, a threat to the bank's security. The human employees he spoke to were shackled by strict protocols, unable to override the automated verdict or offer meaningful assistance. To them, John was a problem, not a person. As evening settled over his modest home, John sat alone in the dim light, the silence heavy with unresolved anger. His country had demanded loyalty, courage, and sacrifice, yet now, in his twilight years, it was the cold machinery of bureaucracy that met him. Every unanswered call, every denied request, every cold automated message was a wound inflicted by an institution he once trusted. He wasn't just fighting for his pension anymore. He was fighting to reclaim his dignity, his respect, and his place in a society that seemed to have forgotten him. John's anger simmered, fueled by the pain of helplessness and the mounting evidence that the system itself had turned against him. The bank's verification was no simple formality. It was a barrier, a wall built of indifference and algorithmic suspicion that threatened to imprison him in an endless limbo. Yet beneath the frustration was something else, a stubborn resolve. If his country had taught him anything, it was how to endure. And endure he would, until justice was served and the truth of his sacrifice was finally recognized. The ripple effect of Emily's video surged far beyond what anyone expected. The rawness in her voice, equal parts desperation and fierce love, struck a nerve in thousands who watched it, shared it, and talked about it. The internet's relentless tide carried her plea across platforms, igniting a firestorm of outrage centered not just on John's frozen pension, but on the cold, impersonal machinery that had trapped him in financial limbo. Comments poured in, veterans sharing their own stories of bureaucratic neglect, advocates condemning the opaque algorithms, everyday citizens demanding accountability. John's story became a symbol, a stark reminder that behind every account number was a human life vulnerable to faceless systems. Among the flood of responses was a direct message to Emily from Captain Sarah Reynolds, a young cyber officer at U.S. Cyber Command. Sarah was no stranger to the digital battlefield. Her career had been built on defending America's networks from invisible enemies. But this wasn't just a technical challenge. It was a moral one. Sarah had witnessed how veterans, many aging and digitally inexperienced, were disproportionately preyed upon or sidelined by modern banking technologies that lacked compassion. She saw John's case as a glaring injustice, a failure of both technology and humanity. Sarah moved quickly, quietly at first, pushing through layers of military bureaucracy to bring John's situation to the attention of her superiors. There was resistance. After all, a direct confrontation with a major financial institution was fraught with risk. Yet Sarah's argument was persuasive. This was not merely a customer service issue. It was a national issue involving the welfare of a veteran, a man who had already given more than most in service to his country. If the state failed its own, who could it trust? As pressure mounted internally, Cyber Command authorized an unprecedented operation, not a hack intended to steal or destroy, but a surgical disruption aimed squarely at the bank's verification servers. The goal was precise: temporarily take the system offline to force the bank's hand, preventing further harm to John and others caught in similar digital traps. It was a bold, calculated move born out of necessity, a reminder that technology should serve justice, not obstruct it. News of the cyber intervention broke quickly, catching the bank's executives off guard. The CEO, once confident behind closed doors, now faced relentless scrutiny. Media outlets seized the story, amplifying public outrage and exposing the bank's callous, algorithm-driven practices. Veteran advocacy groups mobilized, demanding systemic reforms and transparency. The story dominated headlines and social feeds, turning what had been a personal tragedy into a national conversation about accountability, ethics, and the balance between automation and human oversight. Under the glare of public pressure, the bank capitulated. John's pension was released immediately, the freeze lifted as if by magic, but the victory extended far beyond a single man's relief. The bank promised sweeping changes to its verification policies, new protocols mandating human review, especially for vulnerable customers like veterans and the elderly, and a commitment to transparency in how AI systems assessed risk. It was a rare moment where technology's cold logic was tempered by human empathy, a concession that machines alone could never fully understand the complexities of human lives. For John, the thawing of his account was more than financial restitution. It was a restoration of faith. In the face of faceless bureaucracy and digital indifference, unexpected allies had emerged. A young cyber officer, a daughter's viral plea, and a community outraged by injustice had turned the tide. The battle was not just about money. It was about recognition, respect, and the promise that those who served would not be abandoned to the coldness of automated judgment. In the quiet aftermath, John felt a fragile but growing hope, a conviction that even the most entrenched systems could change when confronted with courage and compassion. The restoration of John's pension was swift. Mere hours after the bank capitulated, his funds reappeared in his account, the digital lock lifted like a heavy shackle undone. But the true victory transcended the reactivation of a frozen balance. It was a triumph of dignity over dehumanization, of justice wrested from the cold grip of indifferent algorithms. John's story ignited a fervor that resonated deeply across the nation's veteran community. For years, countless veterans had felt sidelined by systems that failed to acknowledge their sacrifices, trapped in a relentless dance with faceless bureaucracies and opaque technology. Now, John's ordeal and his ultimate vindication became a beacon, a rallying cry demanding respect, transparency, and accountability. The media's spotlight remained intense, not only chronicling John's personal victory, but probing the systemic faults that had allowed it to happen. Commentators dissected the ethical implications of AI-driven banking systems, questioning how often vulnerable individuals might be unjustly flagged or blocked. Veteran organizations leveraged the moment, urging policymakers to confront the growing chasm between technology and human dignity. It was a conversation that reached far beyond finance, touching on the fundamental need for compassion and human oversight in an increasingly automated world. When John finally met Captain Sarah Reynolds face to face, the encounter was heavy with unspoken gratitude and shared resolve. Standing in the modest living room of John's home, the weight of the ordeal hung in the air. His hands, calloused from decades of hard labor and military service, trembled slightly as he reached out. "You didn't just fix my bank account," John said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "You restored my faith in this country." Sarah's eyes glistened with the same mixture of pride and humility. To her, John wasn't just a case file or a digital anomaly. He was a symbol of the men and women who had borne the unseen burdens of war and time. The bank's transformation was more than cosmetic. A new veteran-friendly verification program emerged from the wreckage of the crisis, incorporating human adjudicators specially trained to understand the unique circumstances of veterans and other vulnerable populations. The algorithmic iron fist was replaced by a measured approach that valued empathy alongside security. Meanwhile, lawmakers drafted bills that would impose strict regulations on automated decision-making systems in financial institutions. These laws aim to enshrine transparency, require human intervention in critical decisions, and protect citizens from arbitrary freezes or denials. John's struggle had become a catalyst, forcing institutions to confront uncomfortable truths and rebuild trust on firmer, fairer foundations. In the quiet aftermath, John sat on his weathered porch, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the lawn. His granddaughter, a bright-eyed child no older than 7, nestled against him, her small fingers tracing the lines on his palm. The crisp paper of his pension check lay folded neatly on the table beside them, a tangible symbol of survival in a digital age fraught with uncertainty. But more profound than the financial security was the serenity in John's eyes, the peace born of justice restored and respect earned. The country had finally answered his silent call, not just with money unlocked, but with honor reaffirmed. Here, on this simple porch, the weight of years lifted, replaced by a quiet inspiration. John's battle had transcended personal hardship to become a beacon of hope for countless others. It was a testament to resilience, to the power of advocacy and solidarity, and a reminder that even in a world dominated by machines, human courage and compassion could still prevail.